Well, hello and welcome to our final Friday video for the course. We've been through quite a semester. Thank you guys for sticking with me as we talk about environmental topics and analyze them using some of the tools of economics. We've covered a lot of ground, right? We've talked about why the efficient level of pollution is very rarely zero, how to find what that efficient level of pollution actually would be, and ways to get there, and to get there, you guessed it, efficiently, at low cost, as low a cost as possible. Um, we've talked about things like cost-benefit analysis that we use as a practical way to help determine where we are on those curves and how we can move toward the efficient level of pollution. We've talked about voluntary conservation efforts and getting people to want to give us more of the good stuff and stop doing more of the bad stuff through different sort of incentive programs, but also using social norms and community agreements and things like that. We talked about how the law could be a powerful shaper of incentives and behavior, using kind of decentralized tools that don't require the EPA, for example, to be running everything. We are ending the semester directly addressing the local to global aspect of this course. And so we talked about a quintessential local environmental issue, which is solid waste, municipal solid waste. So not industrial stuff, but the trash and recycling that go on the curve, either in the alley behind your house or out front, or maybe you take it to a transfer station and drop it off. Different communities do it different ways. That's because it's controlled at a local level, right? And the things that work in a relatively rural county like Hart County, Kentucky, might not work well in Nashville, Tennessee, much more substantial metro city, right? So having local control over that issue, it gives a lot of room to fit the local conditions. That's population density, that's infrastructure, but that's also geology and geography and thinking about how these things are going to affect groundwater tables and all kinds of stuff. Solid waste usually is a relatively local issue in that the externalities that come from having trash and how it's disposed of are externalities that are felt most substantially at a local level. And so in that way, it really makes sense to regulate it at a local level, right? To allow that experimentation and that broad range of responses that different communities might want to do. We're not as worried about, Hart County making choices about its trash that are going to lead to large negative externalities that affect people in Bowling Green or in Nashville. Most of these effects are felt at a very local level, which is why we kind of trust people at a local level to regulate it in a way that's appropriate. Because those negative externalities are something that within that political unit, city, county, certainly within state, people are feeling it, and that's where the pressure is going to be to address those negative externalities. Now there are some aspects, for example, you throw a lot of food waste and other things that degrade into the trash. It goes in a landfill in an anaerobic environment without lots of oxygen. It breaks down, and one of the things that it forms when it's in that anaerobic environment is methane. And so that methane works its way up out of the landfill, is released into the air. Methane is actually a potent greenhouse gas. So it's number 2 after carbon dioxide as far as the things that we're really worried about going into the atmosphere and having that greenhouse gas effect. So there is a negative externality that is felt at a very different scale, but that's one of the relatively minor ones. I mean, compared to, if you've ever experienced a community where the waste collection team went on strike, or even during the shutdown for a little while in some communities when the COVID pandemic first started, some communities didn't have waste pickup for a period of time. And it smells bad really quickly. It starts blocking sidewalks, roads, alleys. It starts to be a public health issue in its own right. You get lots of rodent problems, and it gets gross, like really gross, really quickly. If the New York City, uh, the trash people go on strike, man, especially in a place like New York where they don't have alleys and it goes right out front, it only takes a couple days to have things turn pretty gross really quickly. So that's a very local effect. I mean, you smell that garbage when you walk out your door, or maybe even in your house. Um, and so that's the sort of thing that we we might want to regulate at a very local level, these things that you feel at a local level, that can be dealt with effectively at a local level. The methane aspect, that one is not felt at a local level. We don't really care from a local day-to-day sort of experience. We don't see that, feel that. It's invisible. It gets released into the air. That's it. If you're right by the landfill, you might smell it because the methane is in combination with other organic compounds, and it smells bad. But it is not something we worry about for the greenhouse gas sort of aspect in the same way that we would a lot of the other issues that come from solid waste. So there's a justification to maybe take a different approach to that, right? If the methane, we're worried about its greenhouse gas effect, again, that's a global thing that is affecting things all over the world, and we really don't care where greenhouse gases are emitted. We care that they're being emitted. It doesn't really matter if they're coming from Nigeria or from Hart County, Kentucky. So the methane, fits into that category. That's probably something, because of the issue that it's tied up in, the way that the effects are felt, and the way that we need to try to deal with it, both mitigation and adaptation wise, that's a global issue. And so we want to at least look at global responses to something like that. And so as we go from local up to state and then national, we've talked a lot about national environmental laws, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. We've talked about the EPA and other agencies enforcing those. We've talked about how they work with the states and cooperative federalism to do all of that. If we go up the next level to international, that's when things get interesting, and as I alluded earlier, they start to get a little more fuzzy. So we want to deal with something like climate change on a global level because it is a global issue. And that doesn't just mean that it's something there. Water is a global issue. Water scarcity, water quality. Everyone cares about having clean water. That doesn't make water a global issue in and of itself. Water is still within these, cycles that are to some extent regional. So, we have acid rain problems in the Northeast US, and it's tied to emissions coming from the Midwest. There's spillovers across regions. That's why we have something called the Montreal Protocol. There's an international agreement dealing with stuff that we expect to cross borders. Fine. But when we're looking at something like climate change, like greenhouse gases, that's really a global issue. And so that's the big gorilla in the room going forward, because it is such a big, important issue. We've seen action here, right? There's the Convention on Climate Change through the UN. So what does that mean? A convention is basically countries have gotten together and they've kind of said, here's an issue, here's how we're going to frame it, here's how we're going to start thinking about it. So that's a convention, also very similar to an accord. So an accord is another international agreement countries sign on to. It's an accord is usually saying we kind of had these goals that we want to try to reach. The next step up is a protocol. I've mentioned the Montreal Protocol. There was the Kyoto Protocol, which was dealing with greenhouse gases. That's where countries actually come up with not just an issue and how to frame it, but a plan to address it. So the Kyoto Protocol was different countries agreeing to different reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just what the issue is; it's how do we address it? How do we get to a better place? Um, we're still in a world of pretty fuzzy stuff, though, because accords, conventions, protocols, those are agreements countries sign on to, and we saw this with the Paris Climate Accord. They can also say, no, we didn't really mean it. We're backing out. The U.S. did that. We signed on under President Obama. When President Trump came into the White House, he said, we're backing out of the Paris Climate Accord. And now President Biden is saying, we're going to get back in. But so if countries can enter and leave unilaterally, it's not binding in any way. You know, there's not much there, right? And that's even true with protocols. The country signs on and agrees that it's going to reduce emissions. There's no real penalty, no clear penalty for countries that don't meet their target. Once we get to a treaty, so that's an agreement between or among countries that actually does have the force of law. So a treaty in the US, that means it's something that not just the president signs on to, but also it's ratified by the Senate. And so, you know, President Trump could decide to back out of the Paris Climate Accord because as an accord, it was something that basically a president can sign and jump into or jump out of. If it were a treaty, a president couldn't just do that. They would have to go through this process of having it ratified by the Senate. Treaties also tend to have more strong enforcement mechanisms and withdrawal mechanisms. Countries can't just go in and out of them willy-nilly. They're actually made to have this force of law. Now, we see treaties dealing with national defense. NATO is a treaty, right? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There's treaties dealing with trade. So the World Trade Organization oversees a series of treaties, the GATT, G-A-T-T, Global Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, I believe. So there are these treaties that have the force of law. Great. Why don't we just use those and then we can have international laws that have teeth to actually address international issues and have countries follow through on what they say they'll do? Well, it's tough. It's tough to get countries to sign on to treaties. We see that with the U.S. a lot. The U.S. is very skeptical of signing on to these international treaties, often multilateral, involving a bunch of countries. Whether it's a trade agreement, we saw it with the Pacific Trade Agreement, I forget the exact name. Things like the International Criminal Court, the U.S. is saying, you know, we actually don't want to subject our citizens to this international body. It's hard to get countries to sign on to these treaties. It's them relinquishing some of their sovereign power, and countries are very hesitant about doing that. So when it comes to environmental issues, that means we're much more likely to get accords, conventions, maybe even protocols. That doesn't tie the country's hands as much. If we actually got a treaty dealing with something like climate change, it would mean that it has the force of law. If it doesn't happen, there are consequences. That leads us to the question, what are the consequences of an international agreement? You know, if you don't follow a federal law, you can get fined, you can get thrown in jail. Treaties are things signed by countries. You could fine a country, but you can't throw a country in jail. What do you do to enforce this stuff? Trade is the short answer. It's not the only answer, but the most important one by far is we use trade mechanisms as the punishments for countries not behaving in ways that they promised they would in ways that had the force of law. So the most successful international agreements dealing with the environment and in general are ones that have ties to trade and specifically as enforcement mechanisms. And so I've mentioned CITES is probably considered the most successful, well, among the most successful certainly, international environmental agreements. That's the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. And that's countries agreeing not to allow the sale of endangered species or products made from them. And this is one of the reasons why you can't buy a new piano that has ivory keys, with keys made from ivory of elephant tusks. That used to be the most sought after material to make piano keys from, tickle the ivories. That's not allowed anymore. They use synthetic. And why is it not allowed? Well, this Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species says, as a listed species, the elephant, we're not allowed to use products made from them in our regular course of action. There are old things that are grandfathered in, so if you have an old piano, an heirloom sort of piano, that may have real ivory keys, but new ones do not in the U.S. and in most countries, because most countries have actually signed on to CITES. And like I mentioned, like most fairly successful, it has some enforcement mechanisms built into it dealing with trade. So if you're a country that says, we really value having ivory keyboards, or ivory statues, or tiger skin rugs to put in our banquet halls, or I don't know, whatever. The ones you most commonly hear about these days are things like rhino tusk, shark fin, pangolin, these different animal products that are sought after for medicinal purposes in Eastern medicine. That's what you hear most about. And some, like most sharks, are not listed under CITES, so those are legal. Other things like ivory or rhino horn, those are listed, so they're not supposed to engage in that trade. And so if China explicitly says we're not going to allow, or we are going to allow people to buy and sell rhino horn for medicinal purposes, then there's a consequence for them through the trade mechanisms that a lot of countries are involved in. Instead, what we tend to see is China says it's illegal to trade in rhino horn, and they may not be the best at enforcing it. But we all choose what we're going to focus our enforcement resources on. We've talked about that. And they may not choose to put as much enforcement heft behind some of these. That's certainly a criticism that is lobbed their way at times anyway. But anyway, there's an example of an international issue, trade in endangered species, an international agreement to deal with it, CITES. What kind of enforcement mechanisms does it have? How does that practically play out? And a lot of these are used as examples, building blocks for how to approach what I call the gorilla in the room, which is climate change for going forward. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch as you guys keep up with these sort of topics, seeing what countries agree to give up in terms of their own sovereign power in exchange for an international effort to address climate change. It's going to be controversial. It's going to be messy. It's also a really important topic, so it is worth following for sure. And as an economist following it, I'm certainly interested in what use of market mechanisms will be involved. Is there going to be a tax with border adjustment? Is there going to be a cap and trade program of some sort? Can you offset carbon emissions in the U.S. by paying to do reforestation work in Madagascar? Things like that will be really interesting to watch and follow, at least for environmental economics nerds like ourselves. And with that, we are at the end of the semester. And so, again, I thank you guys for sticking with me. I know it's been a crazy time on a lot of fronts. I hope that you have enjoyed looking at these topics that you care about. And I hope that you've learned something about using economic thinking to analyze these issues. being methodical about thinking about the costs and benefits of different actions and different options. I mean, that, in my mind, cost benefit analysis is a framework that can be really helpful for personal decisions all the way up to countries deciding whether to sign on to an international agreement about climate change. So I hope that you share a bit of that excitement for things like cost benefit analysis and apply it in environmental topics and in other topics too. And if I can help you with anything going forward, whether that's thinking about career paths, whether that's getting a letter of recommendation, graduate school, jobs, I'm happy to help. If there's topics that you're curious about and you want to talk more about, would love to hear about it. And I would also just love to hear how you're doing. So keep in touch about environmental stuff, economic stuff, just life in general. Let me know how you're doing. It's always great to hear from students who are going on and doing all kinds of cool things. And some of it's, grad school sort of cool stuff. Some of it's, following an interesting local issue and getting involved in some way. So all of that's important. All of that's good stuff in my book. So I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again.